The wind was bitter the morning her father loaded her into the back of the wagon like she was a sack of wheat gone sour, and not his own daughter, who once rode on his shoulders through apple orchards and sang songs with him beside the fire. But now she had made a mistake in his eyes, an unforgivable one that brought shame to his name and whispers through town. And so, without a word of goodbye or a flicker of mercy in his hardened face, he drove her out past the river and into the hills to a clearing near the base of Crow's Peak, where the trees stood tall and silent as judgment. And waiting in the clearing was a man they called the Mountain Ghost, a man with hands like oak roots and a stare that could stop a charging bull. A man who lived alone and had long stopped caring what the world thought of him, because the world had taken too much already. And in return, he gave nothing back. And when the wagon stopped and she stepped down, her eyes wide with fear and belly round with child, the man looked her over, not with hunger or contempt, but with the cold calculation of someone used to pain and weight and burden. And he said nothing, only took her pack and turned toward the log cabin behind him that seemed more rock than wood, and the father nodded, satisfied at the transaction, the punishment delivered, and without a backward glance, turned the wagon around and rode off into the dust while she stood trembling on the edge of a life she had not chosen, traded like goods, because she had chosen love once and it had ended in betrayal by a man who rode west and never returned, leaving her with a growing child and a father whose pride outweighed his compassion. And now she was left to the mercy of a stranger whose name she did not even know, but whose silence already told her everything. He was a man who didn't need words to say he didn't want her there, but he would not throw her out either, because somewhere buried deep beneath the beard and scars was a code, a sense of duty carved from solitude and hardship, and maybe the ghost of a man he once was. And so she followed him through the creaking door and into the dim cabin, where a single chair sat near the hearth, and a thick fur lay before the fire, and shelves lined with jars and tools, and a bed pushed into the corner wide enough for one and nothing else. And he pointed to the bed, then walked out again, chopping wood as if the world hadn't shifted, and she stood there, trying not to cry, not from fear or cold, but from the crushing realization that this was her life now. A silent cabin, a man who spoke with grunts and glances, and a baby who would soon cry in the night and find no lullaby but the whisper of pine needles against the window. And in the days that followed, she learned the rhythm of that place, how the man rose before dawn and split wood and hunted game and fixed what was broken, without ever explaining why or how. And she learned to tend the fire and cook what little he brought and keep the place clean. And when the baby kicked, she smiled for the first time in weeks, and one day she laughed aloud at a squirrel that fell from a branch. And when she turned, she saw the mountain man watching her from the shadows. His eyes softened, not with affection, but with recognition, like he remembered something long buried, a sound that once lived in his world. And he nodded once, then disappeared back into the woods. And little by little, the silence between them became less sharp, more like a blanket than a blade, and when her labor came early one stormy night, he was there, without needing to be asked, bringing hot water and clean cloth and holding her hand with a grip that spoke of calm steadiness and a kind of reverence she had never known. And when the child came screaming into the night, he held the boy for a long moment before placing him in her arms and saying his first full sentence since she arrived, "You did good, girl." And those 4 words broke something in her. The last wall of shame and fear melted away, and she wept not from pain, but from being seen. And from that moment something changed, not suddenly or loudly, but with the slow certainty of spring thawing a frozen stream. He built a cradle by hand, carving it with careful strength, and when he caught him rocking the boy one night, his rough fingers gentle on the edge of the blanket, he didn't flinch or turn away. Only said he used to have a son once, and that was all. And she didn't ask more, because the grief in his voice told the rest. And in time he began speaking more, little things, pointing to herbs, showing her how to set snares, how to tell when the snow would fall, and they shared food and chores and laughter now and then. And sometimes she sang to the baby and caught him listening, his axe paused mid-swing. And she wondered what his story was, what pain had driven him into these woods and carved him into stone, but she knew better than to ask. Yet each day she stayed, she saw more of the man beneath the mountain. The way he tended the animals with silent care, the way he made sure she never carried too much, the way he always faced the door when it stormed, as if daring the world to bring trouble. And though they shared no bed, they shared everything else. And when her father returned 6 months later, not out of guilt, but to collect her like a man checking if a lesson had stuck, he found not a girl shivering in shame, but a woman standing strong with her child in arms and the mountain man beside her. And this time when the father spoke with disgust in his tone, calling her foolish for thinking this was life, the mountain man stepped forward, looked him in the eye, and said, "She's home now, and you don't speak to her like that. Not here." And something in his voice made the father pause just long enough to see that whatever power he thought he had over her was gone, and without another word, he left for good. And she stood there, shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming feeling of having someone stand up for her for once in her life. And later that night by the fire, she asked the mountain man why he did it, and he shrugged, said, "Because you're mine now if you want to be." And she nodded. And they didn't speak more of it, but in the way he brushed her hair back the next morning, and the way she leaned into his side when they watched the baby sleep, they both knew something had rooted there in that cold, hard soil. Something fragile but fierce, a beginning not built on possession or punishment, but on survival, trust, and a love that grew not from passion, but from presence, from weathering each other's storms and staying anyway. The days turned into weeks, and winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains. But in that cabin, hidden from the cruelty of townspeople and the weight of a name no longer spoken, the woman and the mountain man began to forge a life neither had prepared for. She found comfort in the rhythm of his silence and strength in the quiet way he chopped wood, repaired the roof, and made sure she never went hungry without asking anything in return. And while she had once been afraid of his broad shoulders and rough hands, she began to see the gentleness behind every movement. How he left a blanket beside her chair without a word, how he paused his work when she winced, how he carved small wooden animals when he thought she wasn't looking and left them on the table for her to find. Her belly grew, and with it a sense of calm that came from the strange stillness he carried, like a rock untouched by the wind. And though the nights were cold and the future uncertain, they learned to coexist in shared silence, interrupted only by the sound of firewood crackling or the gentle clink of dishes, until one morning she found herself humming a tune from childhood, and he stopped stacking logs to listen, not with judgment, but with something she could not name. And that was the first time she saw his smile, fleeting, soft like snow on sun-warmed stone. He began to show her the land, the trails he had carved through the forest, the river where trout darted like silver spirits, and she followed with awe and gratitude and began to smile back. They built a cradle together, awkward and clumsy, but filled with more care than anything she had ever known. And when the baby came, a storm howled through the night, but he held her hand through every scream and every tear and never flinched as she crushed his fingers with pain. And when the child finally cried and she collapsed with exhaustion, it was he who held the tiny girl against his chest, eyes wide with wonder, as if he were touching the meaning of life in the middle of nowhere. And in the weeks that followed, he was never far, always watching, always listening, always making sure she had everything she needed. And though he rarely spoke, the way he looked at her now said more than any words ever could. He saw her not as a fallen woman or a burden, but as someone who had survived and kept going, someone who had given birth to light in the middle of nowhere. And because of that, he found himself believing again, not just in her, but in the life they were building, slowly, carefully. And when she finally asked his name, he told her, and it was the first time she had heard it since arriving, and in some ways, it felt like it had belonged to her all along. And in that moment, they were no longer a stranger and a punishment.
They were a man and a woman, a family formed not by blood or duty, but by the sheer will to love where the world had told them they shouldn't. And as spring arrived and the forest bloomed around them, the cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like home.